Welcome to the Human Anatomy lecture. This lecture will be on blood vessels. Blood vessels are part of the cardiovascular system. The other parts include the heart, the parts of the blood vessels which are arteries, capillaries, and veins. And I'll talk about in detail the differences between those parts of the cardiovascular system. The blood vessels themselves are conduits, tubes that are throughout the body. And they are composed of different layers, which we call tunics. The tunica intima, the innermost layer, and it's composed of simple squamous epithelium. You recall this from the overview of epithelium. The tunica media, the middle layer, is composed of smooth muscle. Smooth muscle is involuntary muscle. It is influenced by the nervous system, but the nervous system is not necessary for smooth muscle to control its contractile properties. When the smooth muscle around the blood vessels contracts, that produces a decrease in the vessel diameter, which we call vasoconstriction, and in general that will increase the resistance of blood flowing through the blood vessels and decrease the blood flow. Conversely, relaxation of the smooth muscle in the walls of the blood vessel will cause those vesicles to get larger in diameter, what we call vasodilation. That will decrease the resistance to blood flow through those vessels and will increase the volume of blood flowing through those vessels. The outermost layer is called the tunica externa, and it's composed of connective tissue that may have different names depending on where in the body it is. The inside of the blood vessel is called the lumen, and it is filled in general with blood. Here's a histological preparation, a microscope picture of some loose connective tissue. You can see the adipose cells here to get your bearings. You can see nuclei to get an idea about the magnification. You see the nuclei of cells here. And here are two blood vessels traveling together as they typically do. And in this case, there's an artery, which has a thick wall, a lot of tunica media, the smooth muscle, stained pink here. The tunica externa, you can see stained blue, made of connective tissue. And the internal layer, the tunica intima, which is a thin layer, the simple squamous cells at this magnification are difficult to discern individual cells or individual nuclei. But what is easy to tell is the difference between this vessel and this vessel. These are paired vessels in the same connective tissue, and that means that one of them, the artery, is carrying blood out to the periphery, while the other blood vessel, the vein, is carrying blood back to the heart. The pressure in the artery is higher than in the vein, and that's why blood flows one way through the artery and back through the vein. A result of the pressure difference is that the wall of the artery is thicker in order to be resistant to damage from that high blood pressure. The wall of the corresponding vein is thinner because it doesn't have to sustain that high pressure. The consequence of the high pressure is that more blood flows through the artery than through a given volume of the vein, and therefore the vein is actually larger in diameter. And you see that the total, if this were dilated, the total cross-sectional area of the vein would be bigger than the artery. That's again a consequence of the differences in pressure, because exactly the same amount of blood per unit time has to go back in the vein that went out through the artery, so the blood doesn't pool in the periphery. Those things you can see differences and identify artery and vein just from its appearance in the microscope. Now, there's also a third vessel here, a lymphatic vessel, that is this lumen here, very thin wall. Again, it's simple squamous cells, and it has no smooth muscle. It has little or no connective tissue around it, and I'll come back to lymphatic vessels later when I talk about the lymphatic system in my next lecture. These three structures typically travel together and deliver blood and drain lymphatic fluid from different regions of the body, like the hand or the fingers. Arteries are defined by the blood vessels that carry blood away from the heart, and that's an important and not completely obvious definition. Capillaries are the smallest blood vessels. The blood vessels get smaller and smaller as we go away from the heart. Arteries become arterioles, and they get smaller and smaller and more numerous and become capillaries, which is where the exchange of gases and nutrients occurs between the blood and the tissues that surround them. And then those capillaries coalesce, become bigger, and we call those vessels venules, and venules combine and become even larger. Those form veins, which carry blood towards the heart. There are subdivisions of arteries that you need to be aware of. The largest arteries are called elastic arteries because they have a lot of elastic tissue. You can see that here in the wall of the vessel. And that means that, like a balloon, they will expand under pressure, and then when the pressure is decreased, they will contract, and as they contract, they push the blood out of the arteries. They are a pump that provides blood flow while the heart itself is not contracting. The elastic arteries include the aorta, the largest artery in the body, and the major branches. Sometimes they're called conducting arteries. And they have, like all blood vessels, the tunica intima and the simple squamous cells that line the lumen of the blood vessels. Another name for that simple squamous epithelium in the blood vessels only is endothelium. The tunica intima, the tunica media, and the tunica externa with connective tissue, which has fibroblasts, it has collagen fibers, and in the largest vessels, it has blood vessels that supply the tissue of the wall of the blood vessel. They're so large that they can't get nutrients from the lumen, and they have their own blood vessels, arteries and veins, to supply blood to the tissues that make up the walls of the large elastic artery. Next are muscular arteries, or distributing arteries. They have a lot of smooth muscle in their tunica medias, and they are a major site of control of regional blood flow because the smooth muscle here can contract, causing vasoconstriction, causing increased resistance, causing decreased blood flow to the arms, for example, when we're not using them, and where we're using the legs. The muscular arteries supplying the legs can relax and dilate. The muscular arteries supplying the arms can constrict and reduce blood flow to regions of the body differentially. Most of the named arteries are muscular arteries. The radial artery, the ulnar artery, the subclavian artery, and so forth. Smaller than the muscular arteries are arterioles. They are smaller yet, but they are more numerous. As the small number of elastic arteries gets further out from the heart, they divide into many smaller muscular arteries, and those muscular arteries divide into many arterioles. So the individual cross-sectional area of our arteriole is smaller than a muscular artery, but the total number of them is much larger. They are also have smooth muscle in their tunica media, and they can also constrict and dilate to control more finely the regional blood flow. They are under the influence of two kinds of factors that control the constriction or the relaxation of those blood vessels. Local factors, including anoxia or inadequate oxygen supply to a tissue, and brain control through the sympathetic nervous system. The smallest blood vessels are the capillaries. They are the smallest and most numerous of the blood vessels, and they are filling up almost all of your tissues, with the exception, you should remember, of a couple of tissues of note. All epithelia are avascular. So the upper layer of the skin, the outermost layer, the epidermis, has no blood vessels. The deeper layer, remember the dermis is connective tissue, it does have blood vessels, lots of blood vessels. Other epithelia, the endothelium that lines blood vessels, have no blood vessels to supply them. Mucosal epithelia in the mouth, the nasal cavity, and so forth, no epithelia have blood vessels. And then cartilage, unusually among the connective tissues, has no blood vessels. Everything else in the body essentially has lots of blood vessels that supply nutrients and take away wastes. And the blood contains fluid and contains cells. The most of the cells are red blood cells, and then there's a minor component of white blood cells, and then there are fragments of cells called platelets. Capillaries function to exchange things between the blood and the surrounding tissue. In the lungs, that material will be oxygen that is in the alveolar spaces, the air spaces of the lungs, that diffuses into the blood, and carbon dioxide diffuses out of the blood into the air spaces, and it's blown off. In the small intestines, nutrients are absorbed from the lumen of the small intestine into the blood. Endocrine glands release hormones that are picked up from the extracellular space, carried by the blood around through the body to their target organs. And kidneys have a special role. They filter the blood in special capillaries called glomeruli, and they remove the small molecules and the waste products. Here's a colorized picture of a transmission EM electron micrograph of a capillary, and you can see the walls are simple squamous, one cell thick flattened epithelia, and the lumen contains plasma, fluid component, and red blood cells. And you notice that the diameter of a capillary is actually smaller than the diameter of a red blood cell. So they have to squeeze through by deforming to light up single file to get through the capillary. That maximizes the exchange of gases and nutrients and waste products between the red blood cells and the tissues surrounding the capillaries. There are smooth muscle sphincters, circular muscles, around the upstream part of the capillaries. The capillaries themselves have no smooth muscle at all. They're surrounded by a single layer of simple squamous epithelial cells, and that's the minimum separation possible between the tissue and the blood space. Tendons and ligaments are poorly vascularized. Epithelium and cartilage, I mentioned, are completely avascular, and they receive their nutrients from the blood vessels in the nearby connective tissue. Here's a picture showing a terminal arteriole breaking up into a precapillary. The precapillary has smooth muscle surrounding it and can regulate the local blood flow by constricting or relaxing. The capillaries form a network, large in number but small in size, and downstream they coalesce into venules that collect the blood from the tissues. As the blood passes through the tissues, it loses oxygen, and since hemoglobin, which carries the oxygen, is an indicator protein, the actual color of the hemoglobin changes from bright red to a purplish blue in its deoxygenated form. In general, oxygenated blood is carried in arteries, and deoxygenated blood is carried in veins. However, the primary definition that I gave you earlier applies, that arteries carry blood away from the heart. And so although in systemic circulation arterial blood is oxygenated, in the pulmonary circulation the arterial blood is deoxygenated and looks blue, and the pulmonary veins carrying blood back from the lungs to the heart are carrying bright red oxygenated blood. Some of the capillaries go straight through capillary beds and bypass the sphincters. These are shunts that are constantly open regardless of the state of the smooth muscle in that tissue. The capillary permeability is determined by several factors. The endothelial cells, that simple squamous epithelium that lines the blood vessels, are generally held together by tight junctions and desmosomes that keep large things from leaking out of the blood into the tissues and vice versa. There are some special tissues that I'll talk about, some organs, where there are no tight junctions and larger things move out and into the blood. There are clefts between the endothelial cells, intercellular clefts, and larger molecules, but not cells, not cells in general, can go between the endothelial cells. Continuous capillaries are the most common, and they have tight junctions and desmosomes. Some epithelials are fenestrated. Fenestrae are windows, and these windows or pores allow things to travel across the endothelial lining. Here's a conventional endothelial lining of a capillary, and you can see the tight junctions are very close together, the desmosomes holding them together, and things as large as a cell and even proteins cannot get from the blood out to the surrounding tissue or vice versa. In a fenestrated capillary, you have these holes or fenestrae or windows, and you can imagine that things like proteins, small proteins, can get out of the blood, but things as large as blood vessels cannot. Red blood cells, excuse me. So how can things get in and out of capillaries? Direct diffusion. This is true for small hydrophobic molecules like oxygen, like CO2. Through intercellular clefts, through cytoplasmic vesicles, a process of endocytosis and exocytosis, and through fenestrations. Certain organs, like the brain, have exclusively continuous capillaries with tight junctions, and that barrier forms what's called the blood-brain barrier. In addition to the endothelial cells, there are glial cells, the astrocytes, that form continuous foot processes around the capillaries themselves, and then between the astrocyte foot processes and the endothelial cells are extracellular matrix components that act as a filter. Together, those three components prevent hydrophilic molecules from moving from the blood to the brain and from the brain to the blood. Hydrophobic molecules like oxygen, like CO2, like molecules that dissolve in lipids like steroid hormones, anesthetic molecules, cocaine, heroin, caffeine, things that are absorbed by the body and travel into the brain, are hydrophobic and can go right through the blood-brain barrier. There are some places that are the opposite, where things are very permeable in the blood system. And sinusoids are the extreme example. They have large holes, even larger than fenestrae, large intercellular clefts, and entire cells can move into the blood and out of the blood there. We find sinusoids in bone marrow and in spleen, and red blood cells and white blood cells can exchange at those points. Here's a picture of a sinusoid. It's typically somewhat larger than a capillary itself, and it has large intercellular clefts. Veins conduct the blood from the capillaries towards the heart. Blood is a fluid, so it always flows from high pressure to lower pressure. And blood is flowing from the arteries into the veins as a result of the higher blood pressure in the arteries and the lower blood pressure in the veins. Smallest veins, not brains, veins are called venules, and they come together to form veins. The veins head back towards the heart, and veins have a relatively thin layer of smooth muscle, vascular smooth muscle. Their walls are thinner than arteries. I mentioned two pumps that pump the blood through the cardiovascular system already. The first and most important is the heart, but the elastic arteries form a second pump. While the heart is relaxing, those elastic arteries have filled up with blood, and they release through their elasticity the blood outwards because of the valves in the heart. The blood has to flow away from the heart as a result of the elasticity of the largest elastic arteries. A third pump that's responsible for moving the blood back to the heart, especially in the lower extremities in humans because we stand upright, is the skeletal muscle pump. And that acts in conjunction with the thin-walled veins and valves in the veins to move blood back towards the heart. The pumping action of the heart itself is not sufficient to get the blood back from our feet when we're standing upright. The contraction of skeletal muscle under voluntary control will compress the veins that run through those muscles, and that compression pumps the blood away from this area. Because of valves in these medium-sized veins, the blood can't go backwards towards the periphery. It has to go centrally towards the heart. And then when the muscles relax, the blood vessel becomes larger. It fills up with blood, and it has to fill up with blood from the periphery because of these valves. The blood can't come backwards if a person has competent valves. There are what are called vascular anastomoses. I already mentioned the word, where blood vessels come together to form a network of parallel blood vessels. And these provide redundant or secondary channels for blood supply to various parts of the body. Some regions of the body, like skeletal muscles or the extremities, the fingers and the toes, have many anastomoses, and if one blood vessel, one artery is clamped off, there are other ways that the blood can get out to that area. There are other parts of the body, like the heart and the brain, that do not have vascular anastomoses, and they don't have a secondary blood supply. If one of those arteries becomes compromised or clamped off or blocked, then there is no blood supply to that part of the body, and typically that part of the body will die. I mentioned the vascular supply to the vessels, the Vasa Vasorum. And the tunica externa of the largest vessels have blood supply to supply the thick walls of those vessels. What I've been talking about primarily refers to the peripheral vasculature of the peripheral blood supply, coming away from the heart and going out to the arms, the legs, the head, and so forth. The second branch of the circulation, the pulmonary circulation, comes away from the heart and goes out to the lungs. The pulmonary trunk leaves the right ventricle, which divides into the right and left pulmonary arteries, and those go to the right and left lungs, respectively. That blood is coming away from the heart, so this is a pulmonary artery, even though it carries deoxygenated blood. That blood goes out to the lungs where it becomes oxygenated and then returns back to the left atrium in the pulmonary veins, and from the left atrium that oxygenated blood goes to the left ventricle where it's pumped out the systemic circulation to the entire rest of the body. Time for a little break. Refresh yourself. I'll be back. Okay. The systemic circulation consists of systemic arteries, systemic capillaries, and systemic veins. It carries oxygenated blood away from the heart to the tissues. The aorta is the largest artery in the body. It is, remember what kind of an artery? It's what we call an elastic artery. Here are the named arteries that you need to learn the anatomy of. The heart is here, pumping blood into the systemic circulation through the aorta. The aorta has several different parts. It has the ascending aorta, the aortic arch that takes a 180-degree turn, inferior, the descending or thoracic aorta that passes through the diaphragm and becomes the abdominal aorta. That continues into the pelvis and splits into two large arteries, the common iliac arteries, one on the right, one on the left, and the common iliac artery then divides into, on each side, divides into an internal iliac artery and an external iliac artery. The external iliac artery supplies the superficial structures of the pelvis and the skin of the inguinal region. The internal iliac artery continues deep, and it becomes the femoral artery, which splits into the popliteal artery, the anterior tibial and the posterior tibial artery, and then finally supplies the foot and the toes in the arcuate artery. Back up in the abdomen, other earlier branches of the abdominal aorta include the arteries to a number of internal organs. A pair of the most important are the renal arteries that supply the kidneys on either side, the mesenteric arteries that supply the intestines, and the arteries that supply the spleen, the splenic artery, the gastric artery, and the hepatic artery, which supplies oxygenated blood to the liver. Let's turn our attention to the aortic arch in the thorax. It gives rise to several branches that are asymmetric, unlike all these, which are the same on the right and left side. The first branch of the aortic arch is a large branch called the brachiocephalic trunk. Brachium is the arm, and cephalic is the head. That's a common branch, the first major branch off of the aorta. I should point out that there are coronary arteries that come off as soon as the aorta leaves the heart. They're smaller, they're not well shown here, but they're obviously very important because they supply the heart with oxygenated blood. The major branch, the first major branch it comes off is the brachiocephalic artery, and it then splits into the common carotid artery that supplies the head and the brain, and the axillary the subclavian artery, the right subclavian artery, that then becomes the axillary artery, that becomes the brachial artery, that becomes the radial and ulnar arteries, and so forth, and digital arteries. The second and third branches, major branches off the aorta, are the left common carotid and the left subclavian artery. So you see what's happened here is that one common branch comes off on the right, the brachiocephalic trunk, and then immediately splits into the right common carotid and the right subclavian. Those two arteries come off separately from the left side of the aortic arch as the left common carotid and the left subclavian artery. Oops. And then those branch as the other ones do. The common carotid branches into an internal and external carotid. The external carotids supply the left and right sides of the face and the superficial muscles. The internal carotids come together in a special structure called the circle of Willis. I'll talk about that later. And those arteries supply the brain. Okay. Go back over all these, little bit of review. I've told you essentially all of these facts already. The ascending aorta arises from the left ventricle. Its first small branches are the coronary arteries that supply the heart. And then the aortic arch branches into the brachiocephalic trunk, the left common carotid, and the left subclavian arteries. Here's a picture shows the aortic arch. Again, the coronary arteries not easily seen here. The brachiocephalic, the left common carotid, and the left subclavian arteries. The descending aorta becomes the thoracic aorta that goes through the diaphragm, becomes the abdominal aorta, and then divides into the right and left common iliac arteries. In the head, or in the neck first, we see the common carotid that divides into the external carotid and the internal carotid. External carotid supplies superficial structures. Internal carotid supplies the deeper structures, most especially the brain. And another pair of arteries shown here is the vertebral artery. Is it even labeled here? Here it's labeled all the way up here. The vertebral artery, you may remember, because it goes through the transverse foramina of only the cervical vertebrae. It ascends from the neck, the upper thorax region, ascends posteriorly, and it joins up with the right and left internal carotid arteries. The right and left vertebral arteries join up to form an anastomosis that supplies the entire brain. I'll talk about that later when I have a better picture. The superficial arteries that are branches of the external carotid are named for the regions of the superficial head that they supply. The ophthalmic artery is actually a branch of the internal carotid. Sorry. The maxillary artery, the occipital artery, the facial artery, the lingual artery, and so forth. Here is the base of the brain showing this anastomosis of 4 arteries. The right and left internal carotid arteries, which are coming towards the brain, ascending in the neck, and they're the cut stumps here. And then the right and left vertebral arteries come up here, and they come together into one artery at the area of the pons called the basilar artery. And that basilar artery, receiving blood from the right and left vertebral arteries, then joins up with some communicating arteries that form what's called the arterial circle, or the circle of Willis. Here it is. It's the traditional name, the circle of Willis, and it forms a complete circle of anastomosing blood vessels. That allows the blood from the right and left internal carotids and the basilar artery to mix together and supply all parts of the brain. So that if I were to clamp off the left internal carotid, all parts of the brain would still get blood because of this anastomosing circle of Willis from the other large blood vessels, the right and left vertebral arteries and the right and left internal carotids. After the circle of Willis, coming away from it, are some smaller named arteries, the anterior cerebral artery, the middle cerebral artery, and the posterior cerebral artery. Those are end arterial circulations, and occlusion or blockage of one of those arteries does lead to ischemia, lead to infarction and death of that region of the brain. There is no collateral circulation to supply an alternative to the anterior, middle, or posterior cerebral arteries. Here in the thorax, we can track the arteries and the progression of names. The subclavian artery here in the chest becomes the axillary artery, which becomes the brachial artery, and then that branches into the deep artery of the arm, the ulnar collateral arteries, the common interosseous artery, and the radial artery, which you know from the radial pulse, and the ulnar artery on the medial aspect of the forearm. And then those become an anastomosing arch of redundant or duplicating vessels that supply the hand and the digits. In the abdomen, there are a number of branches that come off the abdominal aorta that supply the tissues of the abdomen. Inferior phrenic arteries supplying the diaphragm area, the celiac trunk, the superior mesenteric arteries, the suprarenal arteries supply the adrenal gland, the renal arteries supply the liver, the kidneys, the gonadal, testicular ovarian arteries supply those gonads, the inferior mesenteric artery, and then finally the common iliac arteries, remember, are the major branches, continuation of the abdominal aorta. Here's a picture that shows all of those branches, and you'll notice that the renal arteries are disproportionately large because they don't just supply nutrition and oxygenated blood to the kidneys, but the kidneys filter the blood as one of their main functions, so they receive a lot more blood than they need in terms of nutrition. Here illustrates the gastric arteries, some of the mesenteric arteries that supply the internal organs. Here are more of them. They're named for the organs that they vascularize, so it's pretty straightforward, but you should go through and remember the specific names of these various structures. That's a job that you just need to do through memorization. Internal iliac arteries, external iliac artery, are branches of the common iliac arteries. The femoral artery, continuation down the leg, the popliteal artery and the popliteal fossa, the anterior tibial artery, posterior tibial artery, it should be obvious where those are located. Here's the common iliac artery, branching into the external, internal iliac arteries. The internal iliac arteries then has multiple other branches to different target tissues. Here is the femoral artery next to the femur, anterior tibial artery, posterior tibial artery, and so forth. Fibular artery next to the fibula. The names make sense if you learned, as you should have, the names of the bones. There's a summary diagram showing all of these names, all these arteries, the branching pattern throughout the body. And in general, so you need to learn at least the major ones of these. And in general, once you learn the arteries, the veins will have the same names coming back from the same organs. All right. We can skip this. Systemic veins. In addition to the major named veins, which enter the right atrium, there are lots of anastomosing veins or venous plexuses. And then there are unusual patterns. One of them I already mentioned, dural venous sinuses. The superior sagittal sinus and transverse sinuses are formed by dura mater that split and drain the central nervous system itself. And then there are a half a dozen places that have what we call a portal system, which are exceptions to the rule that I mentioned to you, that in general, the pattern of blood flow is from the heart to arteries, to arterioles, to capillaries, to venules, to veins, and back to the heart. In some parts of the body, there are arteries that go to arterioles, that go to capillaries, that go to venules, and then a second set of capillaries, and then venules and veins and back to the heart. Those two capillary beds we say are in series. Blood goes through one and then the other, and they're in special places where the blood does something in two distinct organs before returning back to the heart. One of those is in the liver, the hepatic portal system between the intestines and the liver. A capillary bed in the intestines picks up nutrients, takes it to venules and the hepatic portal vein, which then goes to the liver, breaks up into a second capillary bed, delivers those nutrients to the liver for inspection and detoxification before that blood goes then back to the heart. The superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava return venous blood from the upper part of the body and the lower part of the body, respectively. And they join up to dump blood into the right atrium, which then pumps blood into the right ventricle. And the right ventricle, remember, pumps blood out the pulmonary circulation to the lungs. The lungs send blood back the pulmonary veins to the left atrium, to the left ventricle, and then out to the systemic circulation again. Here's a picture. You should be able to identify these structures in your cats. Two kidneys, right and left kidneys. The diaphragm, the abdominal aorta is here. The inferior vena cava is next to it here. Thinner walled and larger in diameter than the abdominal aorta. And you can see renal arteries and veins. You can see the common iliac arteries and the common iliac veins further down in the abdomen. Here are the veins. By and large, with a couple of exceptions, they have exactly the same names as the arteries. So once you've learned the names of the arteries, you're all set for the veins. An exception, several exceptions. I already mentioned dural venous sinuses. They are unique. They don't have any corresponding arteries. And coming back from the head and the brain, the veins, one on either side, that drain the brain are called the jugular veins. There is no jugular artery, and there is no carotid vein. The carotid artery supplies the brain with oxygenated blood, and the jugular vein drains the brain from venous blood. The rest of the arteries, the rest of the veins, and the arteries are named the same. The femoral vein, the iliac vein, the saphenous vein, the radial ulnar veins, so forth. Okay, dural venous sinuses, here a review: superior sagittal sinus, transverse sinus, straight sinus, drain the venous blood from the brain and then into the internal jugular vein. There are also vertebral veins that parallel the vertebral arteries. I mentioned those through the transverse foramina. We can see superficial veins, and we can see the blood in the superficial veins because the walls of the veins are thin, and it looks purplish blue because it's deoxygenated in the systemic circulation. Here they are. Of special note, the median cubital vein is the most common place for venipuncture. It runs right across the cubital or the antecubital fossa. Superficially, it's a fairly large vein. It's easy to see and easy to stick a needle into to draw blood. Here's the cubital vein there. You probably all had blood drawn from there. In the thorax, the azygous vein and the hemiazygous vein and the accessory hemiazygous vein drain blood from the thorax and the ribs into the vena cava. Lumbar veins, gonadal veins, renal veins, suprarenal veins, hepatic veins parallel the arteries. Here they are, draining blood into the inferior vena cava. The hepatic portal system, let me say a few more words about that. It's a capillary bed in the intestines, picks up nutrients, joins up together into a venule, and then a named vein, the hepatic portal vein. There are 3 blood vessels that go to the liver. There is the hepatic artery, I already mentioned, a branch off the abdominal aorta, that goes out to supply oxygenated blood to the liver. There is the hepatic portal vein that brings blood, venous blood, that's picked up nutrients and delivered oxygen in the intestine, and then it breaks up into a second capillary bed to deliver those nutrients to the liver cells. And then that blood coalesces into a third vessel, the hepatic vein. Notice the difference in name between the hepatic vein, carrying blood away from the liver, and the hepatic portal vein, carrying blood to the liver. The hepatic vein then joins up with the inferior vena cava and goes back to the right atrium. Here's that system, blood vessels running to the intestine, from the intestine to the liver, and then from the liver back up to the heart. Deep veins of the pelvis, lower limbs, share the names with the arteries. The great saphenous vein, small saphenous vein are here. Femoral vein, popliteal vein, fibular vein, tibial, so forth. All things that you should already be familiar with. Okay, and here's a summary diagram of the veins. What can go wrong? Lots of things can go wrong. There can be a breakdown of the wall, the tunica media of a vessel. And this is most commonly a problem with the arteries and arterioles because they are the ones that have high pressure inside them. A weakness in the wall will cause that to bulge out in what we call an aneurysm. Those aneurysms can get weaker with age, get bigger with age, and they can burst. That can cause dramatic, severe bleeding. In the aorta, it can cause bleeding out into the abdomen or the thorax and death within minutes. In the brain, an aneurysm that bursts can cause severe cardiovascular accident, a CVA, cerebrovascular accident, and that can cause stroke or death. Deep vein thrombosis of the lower limbs is caused by blood clots. That's a thrombosis. And blockage of the blood supply. Typically this happens in the veins, and that can compromise blood supply to the extremities. Venous disease, particularly diabetes, can cause destruction of the blood vessels. And arteriovenous malformations are congenital or abnormalities that are present at birth. They are unusual, abnormal anastomoses, which shouldn't be there, connections between arteries and veins, and those large vessels then shunt or carry a lot of the blood that is useless. It bypasses the organs, doesn't do anything, but it's like a short circuit or a leak in a water supply. It decreases the amount of blood that goes out to the organs where it's useful. The fetal circulation develops early by month 3. It's somewhat different because the lungs don't supply oxygenated blood to the fetus, the placenta does. And so those come through specialized structures. I won't go into those in detail. The heart also has specialized structures because the right ventricle can't pump significant amounts of blood out to the lung because the lung is collapsed and the vessels are collapsed. So there are shunts or short circuits within the heart or right outside the heart that allow the blood to go from the right side directly into the left side. These are the foramen ovale and the ductus arteriosus up here. When the newborn is delivered, those two structures close off and allow the blood to go out to the lungs. When they expand, the blood vessels expand, the pressure or the resistance to flow drops, and the blood now goes out from the right ventricle to the pulmonary circulation and back to the left ventricle. Later on, atherosclerosis begins, a buildup of calcium-containing plaques within the blood vessels that can narrow the blood vessels and cause decreased blood flow. And a second independent problem is that those atherosclerotic plaques can break off, travel in the blood vessels where the blood vessels get smaller and smaller. They can lodge and block the blood vessels. And thirdly, they can provide a source for blood clots because they're rough and irregular inside a blood vessel, unlike the nice smooth endothelial cells. And those thrombi, fancy name for blood clot, can break off and become a thromboembolism that will also go out to smaller blood vessels and block the blood supply.